Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I have a seasonally appropriate review of a rather spooky mystery novel, The Hollow Man, a.k.a. The Three Coffins by John Dickson Carr, and starring Gideon Fell, celebrating its 90th anniversary in 2025. I always call this book The Hollow Man, but I did notice in doing research here that Three Coffins seems to be the preferred title nowadays, at least in the US. And this is perhaps the best well known Fell novel, certainly an iconic entry into the world of detective fiction. And, I have not yet ranked all the Carr novels for this channel, but I wanted to cover this one now because it was so perfect for Halloween and I didn't want to miss the opportunity. And this is so spooky and creepy. It's really very delightful. And, if you don't know Carr, he is an American slash British writer famous for locked rooms and impossible crimes. His murder mechanics are really just like outrageously complicated most of the time, and a Carr novel's quality more or less hinges, pun intended if you know, solely on how credible and interesting the solutions are. The Hollow Man has a lot more going for it beyond the solution, but in general, I find that to be the case. And Gideon Fell is eccentric. He has a wife who I don't believe we ever see, and it's easy to forget she exists, but apparently she's even more eccentric than he is. And Fell is a historian, a lexicographer, meaning he writes dictionaries, and my personal favorite thing about him is his wild exclamations he shouts when he's surprised. Oh, my ancient hat is my favorite of these. He is probably, or at least rumored to be based on G.K. Chesterton, but as always, I will have a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which time I will warn you it's coming so you can back out if you need to. Spoilers will be fair game from that point forward. And before I begin, make sure you join in the Discord if you haven't already. There are some fun activities going on there you don't want to miss out on. Link in the description. And make sure you like and subscribe and share to keep up to date with the channel. The Hollow Man slash The Three Coffins begins a little unusually here. The third person narrator preps us for what is to come. The narrator lets us know there are two murders, and each of these murders, the killer just completely disappeared inexplicably. The killer seemingly disappeared despite the circumstances not allowing for a clear getaway. The killer is known as the Hollow Man because his disappearance has led people to believe there is nothing under the mask he wears, or under the hat, or under the coat, and that he is nothing but a hollow shell. We're also told that certain witnesses, and they are named, to the events are 100% telling the truth. They are not lying. We're also told this story is told in sort of like pieces, and they have to be stitched together to form the proper tale. We begin at a local pub where Professor Grimmauld is hanging out with some of his friends when they are approached by this very odd man who does bear an odd resemblance to the Hollow Man. This man says he is Pierre Flay, illusionist, and that he and his brother can float out of their graves, and that his brother is looking for the professor and will pay him a visit, with the implication that this is a threat. Grimmauld is freaked out by this, although he claims not to be. Flay also mentions something about three coffins in sort of like a riddle type fashion. We then skip forward a few days. Dr. Gideon Fell is having a little get together with Inspector, now Superintendent Hadley, who gets promoted from the last novel, and a young friend named Ted Rampole. Ted is friends with Boyd Mangan, who is a reporter who was at the pub when this Flay person visited, and Mangan is also smitten with Grimauld's daughter, Rosette. Rampole tells Fell and Hadley that this story about what happened at the pub, because it's his only contribution to this criminology talk, which, to be honest, it's not really his only contribution. He does appear in other novels, but anyway, Hadley dismisses this as nonsense, but Fell is interested, and things have gotten even weirder in the days since. Grimmauld has received the letters every day, but he angrily rips them up. In order to protect himself from Flay and his brother, Grimmauld has purchased a painting of a graveyard, and this is completely irrational, and why Fell has taken such an interest. Grimmauld is a rational man, and this is an irrational response. Moreover, Ted says Mangan tracked down Flay's place of employment, which is this rundown repertoire theater in a bad neighborhood, and spoke to an acrobat named Pagliacci the Great, who said Flay is a very good illusionist and is obsessed with coffins, and he keeps his gear in a box sized and shaped like a coffin. Flay also claimed that he and his two brothers were once buried alive, but only one managed to escape, and that one brother was not Pierre. Fell's gathering is taking place on the night of this potential visit, so he, Ted, and Hadley go to Grimald's house despite all the snow on the ground. When they arrive, they see a figure jumping out of a window, and this person turns out to be Boyd Mangan, who said someone locked them in their rooms and they heard a shot from Grimald's study. So everyone runs and breaks open the study door, and there is Professor Grimald shot in the chest and blood everywhere. He is still alive, but very clearly dying, and Hadley asked him if it was Flay who did this, but Grimald says no, and then just like mumbles something about like still in the house, which doesn't really make sense. He mumbles other words as well. Medical help arrives and they take Grimald away. There is blood on the sofa, which is not where they found Grimald, and that creepy painting of the graveyard has been slashed. And it's noted the slashes look very natural because the painting is a horror to begin with. Hadley still isn't buying a lot of the Flay stuff or that the murderer is still in the house, but the only ways out of the house are the study, through the study door into the hall, through the window, which is ruled out because the snow is too high and it's unbroken, or through the study door. But Stuart Mills was there and he said no one exited through the door. And Stuart Mills is a young goblin looking man who is Grimald's secretary and is one of the witnesses we are specifically told is telling the truth. As Mills tells his story, Fell focuses on the fireplace and a set of books that have dust on them when others don't. But as Mills explains, Dr. Grimald told him he was going up to his study and didn't want to be disturbed. This was the normal routine, but Grimald said a visitor might show up at 9:30, and one did. The housekeeper, a Madame Dumont, let this tall man wearing a mask into the house, and she was totally creeped out by him. And the visitor was just rude and sort of barged his way into the study. Grimald seemed a bit surprised and confused by this visitor he was supposed to be expecting, but the two went into the study and the door was locked from the inside. And yes, this is a locked room mystery. Madame Dumont says she was pushed out of the room. Mills constantly refers to her as a pythoness, and she calls him a little boy. Like, even in this dark and spooky novel, we still have some of the petty squabbles we so often get. But as much as these two don't seem to get along, they do pretty much back up each other's stories more or less. Madame Dumont seems particularly upset, and all she wants to do is go see Professor Grimald, but before he dies, but Hadley and Fell put her through the ringer. In short, Madame Dumont appears to have been a former lover of Grimald. They met when she worked as a costumiere at a Parisian opera house, and she is Rosette's mother, but she doesn't like Fell poking around, but, Fell is just, like, unperturbed, and asks her some really odd questions about Seven Towers and what that painting is of, and how it's about a country that doesn't exist, and it's all very weird, as, these novels tend to be. If you're unfamiliar with Gideon Fell, the relationship between Fell and Hadley is basically the same as the relationship between Poirot and Inspector Japp. They're friendly, but the inspector gets easily irritated by the other and is often kept in the dark. But Madame Dumont doesn't know anything about anything, and then she just leaves the room. Fell, Hadley, and Rampole discuss those cryptic last words that we get some more details about. Each heard different random words and phrases like hover, bath salts, wine, too much light, something about suicide, maybe, or not suicide, and a fox on a roof in the snow, and something about a rope. It's hard to discern here because each man heard different things, and of course Fell is adamant that what he heard is the correct words, and he begins his explanation by saying Madame Dumont was mostly telling the truth, but she did lie about a few things. Madame Dumont, by the way, not one of the witnesses explicitly said to be telling the truth. Fell just rattles off what he knows, as is his habit. He leaves everyone baffled. He says Dr. Grimald's real name is Caroli Hovarth. It was Hovarth, he was saying, not Hover, and that's not French, and neither is Madame Dumont. He is Hungarian by way of Transylvania, which, back then was part of Hungary, though even in the current day of the story is now part of Romania. And he had two brothers, and all three were imprisoned in Transylvania and forced to work in a salt mine, not bath salts or wine, salt mine. And the name of the prison translates to Seven Towers. And if you're wondering how Gideon Fell would know the name of a Hungarian prison near a salt mine, well, that's just the kind of thing he knows. But Fell seems to suggest that Dr. Grimal must have done something to his two brothers as represented by three coffins. The implication is that Grimal betrayed the other two during an escape and then fled to England, although Fell doesn't actually say that. Fell suggests before Grimal died, but after he was shot, Grimal exerted himself to the point where he worsened the wound because he wanted to burn incriminating papers about his past. And Madame Dumont knew all of this because she kept staring at the fireplace as if she wanted to make sure something was completely burned. Fell thinks Pierre Flay is one of the brothers, but thinks the shooter might be the other brother, whom they call Henri because they don't know his name, because the other brother was tall. Like the visitor in the pub was much taller than the one the visitor to the house was much taller than the one who visited the pub. Fell and Hadley speak with Boyd Magnan and Rosette, and they claim to have spoken with the visitor through a door, but they thought he was a man named Anthony Pettis, who is a friend of Grimal's, but it couldn't have been him because Pettis is way too short. But Rosette and Mangan's story mostly holds true. I mean, they heard the shot, but they were locked in the living room, so Boyd had to jump out of the window. Earlier in the evening, Rosette said she heard a loud thump, but that was before the visitor showed up. And when she looked out the window, she didn't see anything, but then she suddenly remembers something, but won't say what it is because she thinks the police won't believe her. Hadley actually does believe her and comes up with this idea that the murderer avoided leaving footprints in the snow by either just like being in the house already or by rigging a zip line from the roof. Fell knocks those down, especially the zip line, as just ridiculous. But then Fell asks Rosette why she thinks Mr. Draymond is guilty. Mr. Draymond is a poor friend of Grimal who lives in the house. Madame Dumas also hinted she thinks Draymond did it because Draymond wears a very similar mask as the visitors do, and because he celebrates Guy Fawkes Day a lot. He's a big, like, goes all out for Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November. And Draymond's two children died when they fell off a roof, and one of them was born on Guy Fawkes Day, so he goes all out for it. But Rosette, of course, doesn't answer that question either. Word comes in that Grimal has died from his wound, but before he died, he told the doctor his brother killed him, but passed out before he could say like what he wanted to say about that brother. But he did say the shooter just disappeared from the room. Fell tries to decipher the rest of the victim's cryptic words like fox, and now Fell isn't that suspicious of Draymond because he thinks the word fox really was Fawkes, as in Guy Fawkes. Don't blame poor Mr. Fox or Guy Fawkes. Grimal knew the mask was a Guy Fawkes mask, but also its wearer wasn't Mr. Draymond. And, like, why would Mr. Draymond wear his own mask to commit a murder like that? It doesn't make sense. Mr. Draymond says he met Grimal in France, and Fell is just like, let's just skip all of this nonsense. We know who Grimal really is, so tell us the story correctly. And Draymond does. Draymond helped Grimal escape from prison. He was traveling in Europe when he came across three graves outside a prison, and this is why I saved this novel for October. A hand popped out from one of the graves. Terrified, Draymond stayed still until an entire body came out, and that was Grimal, and Draymond took a nearby shovel and helped him out. As Grimal explained to Draymond, he and his two brothers were in prison for political purposes, but his two brothers contracted bubonic plague and died. With the help of the prison doctor, who was also an inmate, Grimal faked his death via plague to escape. And this was easy because it was the plague, and no one would have wanted to go near enough to the body to actually check. Because he was escaping, Grimal was buried with nail clippers to help break out of his coffin. Once he was free, he and Draymond left the area, where Draymond says they went to France with Madame Dumas and then to England when Grimal inherited a property. Fell asked if the grave was shallow, and it was, and he asked if the prison was in a nice part of the country, which Draymond doesn't remember, but he does know the prison was under intense scrutiny for letting the plague get out of hand, so it wasn't in the government's good graces. But Fell isn't buying any of this either. He believes Draymond thinks this is correct, but what Fell really thinks happened is that the brothers were not in prison for political purposes, but for stealing large sums of money, hence this sudden inheritance. He thinks all the brothers faked bubonic plague and death, got buried outside the prison in an escape attempt. However, when Charles Grimaud broke free with Mr. Draymond, he left the other two buried behind. Remember, he left the area quickly because he didn't want Draymond to hear banging from the other coffins because they were buried shallowly. Then, because the shovel was left behind, prison officials would have gone out and looked for it, and they would have heard the banging and the screaming from the other two brothers and dug them up. Because the prison was troubled, the officials never would have reported Charles Grimaud's escape. Charles moved to England, and the other two brothers, Pierre Flay and Henri, they would have been returned to prison. Before Fell and Hadley leave, they take Draymond's coat because it has blood on it, which he cannot explain. He says he took a sleeping pill and was asleep the entire night. The next morning, Ted Rampole tells his wife Dorothy all about this, and Dorothy has some ideas. She doesn't like Rosette and Mangan and thinks Rosette must be involved somehow, but she really suspects Mr. Pettis because he is so unlike the masked figure that arrived that in itself is suspicious. But all of this is interrupted by Fell, who announces there was another murder the previous night. In fact, Pierre Flay was shot dead in the middle of Cagliostro Street, and his murderer too disappeared and did not leave any footprints in the snow, and 3 people witnessed this. Flay was murdered only about 15 minutes after Grimaud was, and one would think you could rule out the people in the Grimaud house, but you can't. You can rule out Mills and Madame Dumont, but Rosette left the house in the ambulance with her father, who was taken to a nursing home that borders Cagliostro Street, and Mangan and Draymond were absent for a long time. Our acrobat friend Pagliacci the Great, who is really an Irishman named O'Rourke, came to identify the body, and he said Flay did show up for a performance that evening, but didn't go on and left because he was visiting his brother. It's not entirely clear where Pierre Flay was going when he was murdered, though. He did have rooms on Cagliostro Street, but they were nowhere near where he was gunned down. Moreover, witnesses heard a tall fellow say, "The second bullet is for you," just before he pulled the trigger. Mr. Pettis visits Dr. Fell, that is Grimaud's short and club-footed friend, and he is interested because he was at the pub the night Flay visited, and he gets a bit nervous because Hadley says he's a suspect because he doesn't have like a true alibi, and Pettis says he was at the theater alone and then visited Grimaud's house, but then went to the nursing home when he learned he was shot. Pettis also mentions the snow and says that snow was not forecast in the weather report. This upsets Fell because Fell was thinking the snow is very important. Like previously, he talked about how the murderer wouldn't be able to know for certain when the snow would stop. So clearly Fell is thinking something about the snow that he's not revealing to us. Pettis also tells them about Mr. Burnaby, who is another friend of Grimaud's. He's the artist who painted the 3 grave paintings a few years back, and Grimaud bought it from him and then made a big deal about like wanting to pay for it when Burnaby was willing to give it to him for free, and then like rolling it up and wrapping it in brown paper and all of that. Fell, Hadley, and Rampole head to Cagliostro Street to search around, and it much the same thing there. The murderer, who they think is brother Henri, just disappeared, leaving no footprints. One of the sergeants guides them where it appears the murderer originally came from, and it's a small, like, dingy flat where they find some blood and a lot of, like, burglary equipment, and this gets a little bit cartoony here because these are all, like, weird gadgets, like suction cup devices to help climb buildings and odd-looking ropes. Pagliacci the Great / O'Rourke is there, and he tells them this isn't burglary equipment, this is gear for an illusionist, and describes all the different ways illusionists use these items in their acts, and how the public knows they're illusions, but they get upset when they find out how the tricks work. He tells about how like illusionists appear to travel through keyholes and disappear when in reality they just change clothes and blend in with the crowd. The flat is rented by Mr. Burnaby, who is said to have a club foot as well. A lot of people with club feet here. And it's not looking good for Mr. Burnaby, but Fell thinks he's innocent because he thinks Burnaby is playing detective and rented this small flat in the middle of a bad neighborhood to keep this a secret because he doesn't want his friends to make fun of him. Awfully conveniently, Burnaby shows up to his rented lodging with Rosette. Burnaby says he asked Rosette over to the lodgings the previous night, even though he wasn't there. Rosette did not go either because she lost the key she had been given and also because her father had been shot. But Rosette says someone was in that flat because she saw the lights when she was at the nursing home with her father. And this is a bit weird, but Rosette thought Burnaby was blackmailing her father over his past, but in reality, Burnaby was simply investigating Grimald's past and dropped hints to Rosette that she misconstrued as blackmail. But Burnaby painted that picture of the three graves that Grimald purchased. Burnaby explains that the inspiration for that painting was a lecture he attended about Hungary, and when Grimald saw the painting, he freaked out. And that's when Burnaby started investigating his friend's past. He thought there was something going on. And Burnaby was also present that night at the tavern, and he seemed to think that Grimald thought Pierre Flay was not his brother, but perhaps the doctor at the prison who helped him escape. But Burnaby does admit to playing detective, but he says that trick rope found in his lodgings, that's not his. He's never seen it before. There was also a brand new coat hanging in the common area hallway covered in blood, and Fell speculates that Draymond somehow accidentally came in contact with that coat, and that's how we got blood all over him without knowing it. Fell, meanwhile, is going on about church bells and how he wants to see Pierre Flay and where he lived and see what kind of evidence there is for this brother Henri. He doesn't really find anything there, but when he returns, Hadley is all a mess because that bloody coat has somehow changed colors when Fell was away. It's not yellow, it's now yellow when it was black, so that's a bit weird. Also, there's a lot of arguing over whose coat this is. It fits Mangan, but he says it's not his, and there's a lot of chatter about where this coat was and was it at Grimald's, was it in the closet there, or was it never there, and no one can agree on that. And then we have a very interesting and notorious chapter in detective fiction. Chapter 17 of The Hollow Man breaks the fourth wall. Fell, Hadley, Rampole, and Pettis have lunch, and this is where Gideon Fell gives his thoughts on locked room mysteries and explains all different ways a locked room mystery can be set up and the solutions to them. In doing so, he does actually spoil quite a few mystery novels, some by name and some not by name, but if you've read them, you can figure them out. And these are really only spoilers if you are paying attention and remember that if you go to read those other books. Fell heaps a lot of praise on Anna Catherine Green, who died the year this novel was published. And Fell also humorously tells Pettis to shut up because they're all in a mystery novel, again breaking the fourth wall. Fell tells the reader he or she can skip this chapter since it's not plot relevant. I strongly disagree you should skip this or not. And I also disagree that it's not really plot relevant. It kind of is. By reading the different theories, it is supposed to get your mind running on how these murders may have been committed. But at the end of the chapter, Fell receives news that Mr. Draymond has now fallen ill. Apparently, Draymond announced he had some revelation about how Grimald might have been killed, including that someone was in his own room earlier that night. Draymond went up to the study alone and then came down and passed out. He mumbled something about chimneys and then passed out, and then everyone starts arguing again about the coat. But Hadley comes in all upset because he's heard back from Bucharest, and brothers, as suspected, were not political prisoners but bank robbers, and the third brother, the one that everyone calls Henri, is dead. His real name was Nicholas, but they still call him Henri, so I will too. But when the prison officials went back to the graves to place crosses, they found Grimald's open grave and then realized what happened. They dug up Pierre and found him alive and took him back to prison, but when they dug up Henri was already dead from suffocation. And this bothers Fell not at all, and this is where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Dr. Fell spends the entire night trying this experiment with reading burned scraps of paper while Rampole and his wife reconstruct several timelines. And if you've been a long-time follower of this channel, you know what I'm going to say about timelines. They are totally useless. Anytime you have a fleshed out specific timeline, just throw it out. It's wrong. I didn't really talk about it in the spoiler-free area because, it doesn't truly matter and I didn't want to give it away, but there's a lot of page time dedicated to establishing, when things happened, and it's all obfuscation as Fell clears up. Fell made several comments about how this case isn't topsy-turvy or upside down, like everyone says. It's backwards. Throw out the timeline. Pierre Flay was murdered first. and he was killed before Grimal. The reason why everyone thinks it happened after is because the witnesses all used the clock in the jewelry store window, but the time was off by 40 minutes. And there's other evidence to support this. I mean, the church bells ringing is one of them. And also, this is so difficult to actually like contemplate, but Hadley had sent a constable to check out Pierre Flay's lodgings after Grimaud was shot, and he arrived there well after Pierre Flay was shot, and things had clearly been going on there for a while. Like the body had been moved already, and like the witnesses had already been questioned. And this is such a good clue, like early on, that something is off, but it's such like a hard one to actually see until it's pointed out to you because you don't get it in the right order. But all of this is leading up to the big reveal, and everyone goes back to Grimal's house where Grimal is laid out in a coffin, and Fell asks Madame Dumas for a confession, and she says she didn't kill anyone. And Fell knows this, but he says that she was an accomplice too, and then he points into the coffin at Grimal. And this has always nagged me since I first read this novel because I remember very clearly the first time I read this novel, I suspected Grimal was the murderer all along, and I rejected that, and I'm still kicking myself over it. I thought it was Pagliacci the Great, but he was an acrobat, and I fell for that. But Fell, tells this very like piecemeal explanation that I'll try to order and streamline. When Flay approached Grimal at the tavern, that wasn't a threat on Grimal's life. That was a blackmail threat. Grimal was now rich and rich off the money the brothers stole together from the bank, and Flay wanted his share. But Grimal was not going to risk that, and he decided to murder Flay and created this whole scheme of acting like Flay was after his life. Grimal intended to go to Cagliostro Street, shoot Flay, and make it look like a suicide. He then intended to go back to his house and pretend that Flay was the visitor and then shot him and escaped. Grimal would self-inflict a gunshot wound that was non-fatal and then leave a rope hanging out the window to make it look like Flay escaped that way. Remember, the forecast said no snow, so no footprints would have been a factor. But that's not what actually happened. Knowing he was never disturbed on Saturday night in his study, Grimal left his house via the service entrance and went to Cagliostro Street to shoot Flay. It was still snowing at this time, so his footprints were covered by the falling snow. He went to Flay's flat to shoot him and did so, but Flay did not die. In fact, he fought back and ran out of the building. Flay shot Grimal, who was still in the building, and that was the shot that witnesses heard, and it explains why they didn't see a shooter and why that shooter disappeared, because Flay was the shooter when they were looking for who shot Flay. The second bullet is for you. It wasn't a warning to Flay. Flay said that to Grimal. That was the second bullet, the first being the one that shot him. Grimal was only superficially wounded, and since this is what he planned all along, he just continued on with his scheme, which is even more necessary now since he didn't know if Flay had actually lived. Grimal returned home via rooftops on Cagliostro Street and other means. The snow had stopped, but he still didn't leave footprints because he returned via the service entrance again, and the service entrance has an overhang, which is why there was no footprints. Admittedly, this is the weakest aspect of the solution, in my opinion, as it doesn't really work out and explain a lot. Grimal apparently went to the house next door and then jumped to his house. Remember, Rosette heard a thump. That was Grimal returning home from the roof. Carr absolutely speeds through this part to cover up its weaknesses. It's a little obvious, honestly. But Grimal then continued with his original plan and dressed up in the mask and the coat. Through the door, he said he was Pettis to Mangan and Rosette. Madame Dumas escorted the masked figure upstairs to the study. Mills saw the figure but didn't realize it was Grimal because of a trick of a mirror that created an illusion that there were two people, one in the study and one outside the study. Madame Dumas had to be in on the trick so as not to break the illusion by standing in the wrong spot. The mirror trick is very complicated and difficult to understand, but there is a novel, in the novel has a very helpful diagram to explain how this works that makes it a lot easier than I can in words. The masked figure of Grimal entered the study and was alone there. He then ripped off his costume and his mask, burned them in the fire fireplace. The costume was made of paper and cardboard, like they are on stage when an illusionist does this trick. And Madame Dumont, remember, is a former costumiere. This was one of the tricks Pagliacci the Great / O'Rourke described. Grimaud then took the heavy mirror and shoved it up the fireplace. The fireplace was looked into, but the flue was very narrow, so one can't actually look into the flue. You can only look up the flue. However, the mirror was very heavy, and the exertion caused the superficial wound to hemorrhage, and Grimaud died, but not before releasing a Guy Fawkes firecracker to simulate a gunshot. There's more to it than that, but that's the simplified version. There's a lot more regarding the overcoat and how the mirror got into the house and all the other things. The mirror was hidden behind that painting of the Three Coffins. That's why he had purchased that painting, to hide the mirror behind it so no one would know he had a mirror. But Mr. Drayman suspected this, and he found the mirror in the flue. And when he took it down, the weight of that caused him to have a stroke. But we are led to believe that he will recover. How Fell could possibly know that, I don't know. But Madame Dumont admits in her own way that, yeah, this is all true. And then she commits suicide with a knife she had taken from the study. It's very Romeo and Juliet esque, but, that is the end. Let's get into praise. And I think the singular best thing about this novel is its atmosphere and tone. It is so eerie and spooky and unsettling without ever crossing the line into horror or scary or even goofiness, as it sometimes can happen. It's not overdone, and I think Carr handles this beautifully. You're not really going to get scared, but you're going to get a little. Well, you'll feel the spookiness. Carr doesn't set the scene as eerie with the usual fog and nighttime. In fact, this novel takes place in a snowstorm, generally not scary, and about half of it takes place during the daytime. But Carr incorporates those supernatural and spooky elements directly into the plot. Grimaud's, I mean, the name alone does it, but Grimaud's background in Transylvania and his eerie disguise and he and his brothers rising from their graves all contribute to both the plot and the tone, which is ideal. I think too many writers try to set a scene, but it's all set dressing. Carr is doing the extra leg of not relying on that, putting in the effort to do both. And it lasts throughout the entire novel. Sometimes I feel authors sort of set the tone at the beginning and then hope it sustains throughout the novel, and it never does. And we have characters described as goblin like. We have illusions and tricks, and Carr really went all out on this novel, and the result is incredible. And this is a very good murder plot as well. Carr's novels do tend to be unsolvable, not because they don't make sense, but because they're just overly complicated and truly bizarre. And I have a lot of fun with those, but in my opinion, the truly elite mystery novels are ones that both have that intricate and creative and sort of zany, crazy plot, but are also easily credible. You can have it both ways. And Carr's solutions are often a bit of, a face palm, and they do often fall into that mostly but not entirely credible category. But here, I find the cluing excellent. We've been warned outright about how someone can change clothes in an instant, like illusionists do. We're told different possible solutions for locked room mysteries. Those are definitely more meta clues, but we also have Madame Dumont being the former costumier, in Grimaud needing two burly men to carry the painting upstairs because it's incredibly heavy. When we were told that when he purchased it, Grimaud was able to roll it up and carry it under his arm. So, hinting at the mirror having been placed behind the canvas. This one is solvable. And on my first read, I almost got there. I did fall into the trap of thinking it was Pagliacci the Great just because he was an acrobat, and that would make sense. But, I thought he was Henri, and now I know that was sort of an obvious trap and red herring. And I also love chapter 17, the locked room mystery lecture. Do not skip that one. It is absolutely worth it. One of the most iconic chapters in detective fiction. Now, for criticism, I mean, the biggest knock for me is the footprints. Now, I praise the solution for good, and it is, but admittedly, the footprints are not great. It doesn't really work or make sense, and you can kind of sort of sense Carr notice this as well because he just sort of like explained it like really quickly and vaguely and then never mentions it again as if he knew this wasn't fully thought out. And this is an issue because it was one of the main plots of the novel. Like it constantly gets brought up about these footprints. And I do find it hard to believe Grimal, after being shot, was somehow able to basically jump from rooftop to rooftop. I think we're supposed to believe there were no footprints because they were all on rooftops, but that doesn't work. I mean, first of all, the roof of Grimal's house was examined and we're told it was clear. The surface entry having an overhang only explains the lack of footprints at that particular spot, not anywhere else. It's just a bit weak, and you just have to like go with it. And the same thing with like, oh, the timeline being off because the clock in the shop window was 40 minutes off. That's like a little bit, cliche. And like 40 minutes is a long time to know. It's not like it's like 5 minutes. That's a long time to be off. I also think some of the characters were a little lackluster. None of them are duds, but characters have never really been Carr's strong suit outside of like the recurring cast. Like Rosette Grimal in particular, I think is a really weak character and sort of went to waste. I also think characters like Mr. Pettis and Mr. Draymond came into the novel a little late to be viable suspects. Technically, we do meet them earlier, but it was a very fleeting encounter and just a mention of them. I personally don't have an issue with this, but I will mention it here because some people do. But I don't mind the novel breaking the fourth wall, like chapter 17, where Carr mentions they're all characters in a mystery novel. At the beginning, we're told who is telling the truth, which is a bit of a clue, as those witnesses are named, priming you not to trust other witnesses who were not named. And none of this bothers me, but I do think this is something mystery writers should not do. I think this is something you should generally avoid. It is very risky, and most won't be able to pull it off, especially with a third person narrator. And let's get into our characters, starting with our hero, Gideon Fell, who is in some ways very Poirot coded as sort of the very eccentric man who seemingly knows everything right away with little explanation and then provides that explanation as if it was so obvious all along. And he was delightful here. I mean, really showing off his academic skills and abilities in this novel. There were fewer sort of like fun character moments from him, but this is a novel that's more serious in tone than most Gideon Fell novels. Like there were definitely less uses of the phrase "oh my ancient hat," which again a shame, but that's something he's known for. But Carr really uses him as a mouthpiece for his own thoughts on detective fiction very effectively, and he is up to his usual antics here of just like coming up with outrageous suggestions that turn out to be true or mostly true, as is the case. And then we have Superintendent Hadley, who I earlier compared to Inspector Japp. I would say Hadley is less of like the brunt of jokes than Japp is, but in this novel, Hadley is particularly very perturbed by Fell's antics. This might be actually be the most angry he gets with him, and just like feeling left out, especially when Fell is focusing on like totally different things than what Hadley wants. I wouldn't say Hadley comes across as like an idiot in this novel or in others, but Fell does like run laps around him. But we do see Hadley like be able to work some things out for himself, usually like of like lesser importance or like things like Fell has already found out. But he also does get his jabs into Fell as well. It does go both ways here. And we also have Ted Rampole, who is a recurring character we first met in Hag's Nook, along with his wife Dorothy. And Ted often does seem to like fall into the background, and not just in this book. We often see him and he just kind of like falls away. He's not nearly as experienced in crime as Fell or Hadley, and he's much younger than them, so there is a generational difference. Ted definitely like serves as more of like the amateur mind, more relatable to the reader, who is just as often as baffled as Ted Rampole is. I'm glad there is this character in Carl novels because I think sometimes you take like the Ellery Queen cousins, they don't realize or take into consideration just like how convoluted their mechanics are, whereas Carr through Ted makes it more relatable to the reader because there is someone else who doesn't understand what's going on. And I think some writers who do these more like impossible crime, like high academic standard talk, seemingly forget that not everyone is on their level. And I think Ted helps the novel age better. Back in the day, these books were written for specific audiences, but now we have larger and larger swaths of people who know how to read and do read. Hopefully, they read. So I think Ted Rampole is more of our everyday eyes here. We have our murderer slash victim, Charles Grimaud, who we did not get to see alive outside of like the first little bit there, or at least like unwounded, but I think we can still sort of make out a lot of his character. I love how Carr writes him. He doesn't really go the route of presenting a morally good person and then finding out later on that he was a terrible human being, but rather sets Grimaud up immediately as someone who is, something suspicious about him in his past. And we're very much forewarned that Grimaud is a bad guy, but that evilness is initially overshadowed by like what Pierre Flay is doing, and he's being creepier. But then we learn Grimaud left his brothers to die in a terrifyingly gruesome way of being buried alive, and then it's hardly a stretch to think he's a killer after that point. But Grimaud is definitely one of the most like gruesome killers from the golden age of detective fiction. We have Pierre Flay, our other victim slash murderer, who again very much cut from the same cloth as his brother. He sort of has the opposite trajectory as the initial clear villain turned victim, but not a sympathetic victim by any means, despite his backstory of having been buried alive and returned to prison. I mean, for me, Flay makes the novel what it is. He's providing a lot of like the spooky tone, like how he says he and his brothers were buried and one of them escaped and that one wasn't him. And this is technically a true story. He's not lying. He is out of, ghostly presence he has. And of course, he's not a literal ghost, but a figurative one, something from someone's past who has suddenly resurfaced to haunt Grimaud. Just an excellent character. We also have an accomplice in Madame Dumas, who I thought was a fine character, definitely like the creepy elderly lady of the manor who just sort of like skulks about the place and speaks cryptically. I thought she could have used more personality, as I often find with a lot of like one-off car characters who aren't, the main murderer, and even then. But I thought her rivalry with Mills was funny, as they both seem to just hate each other for no reason. I like how her past as a costumier was an important clue, and is one of those ones you almost certainly miss, but seems like very obvious in retrospect. And her demise of committing suicide over Grimaud's coffin was very melodramatic, very like Romeo and Juliet esque. To be honest, I think this is a good character, but I never felt the connection and love she had for Grimaud, so it made for an ending here that I thought was like a little bit odd. Moving on to our regular characters, we have Boyd Mangan, who is one of those sort of rowdy young male, like staple archetypes of the Golden Age. He's a reporter, and I wish he sort of like fit into the story more. I wish he had some kind of role, not necessarily in the murder, but something like beyond just like being like a suspect and like a highly unlikely one at that. He provided a lot of like the background information to Fell and Hadley, and that seemed to be his primary purpose. His relationship with Rosette, which is sort of routine and did not provide really a story at all. And like I've said many times, I often find Carr isn't like the best with character work, but I also feel like he's not the worst. I also feel like Carr's stories are not necessarily ones that need excellent character work. That's not really his style. So having these sort of like plainer characters isn't as big of a negative as I think it sounds like, and it would be for other authors. We have Rosette Grimaud, who I thought was clearly the weakest character of the bunch. She really just like did not bring anything to the table. I mean, her backstory of her birth and the secrets of that really just did not factor in at all here. I did not find her very like personable, and she was just there because all of these mystery novels need that like young, attractive woman archetype. Like she did not need to be there, and I felt she was a bit of a missed opportunity of like what could have been with her. We have Mr. Draymond, who I liked a lot, and he reminded me a lot of those like scary old man you would see in like a lot of children's stories, and whom everyone is afraid of. But he's like really a very nice person in reality. I got like Edward Scissorhands sort of vibes here. I mean, not exactly, but again, he's very unlike a lot of characters we see in mystery novels. I really can't think of someone similar to him, and it was a bit of a shame we didn't see more of him. And he does get a lot of sympathy thrown his way, which again I feel like is justified. But again, I feel like we should have gotten to know Draymond more to make that sympathetic quality just more profound. Like it felt a little bit routine as well. And finally, we have Stuart Mills, he of the goblin like appearance, which is just very mean description. And he's another character that just sort of there to provide information. He did have his tiffs with Madame Dumont, but other than that, he just seemed to be there for atmosphere and provide information. Again, he's not really a suspect. I guess it could have been a fun twist to like have us say, like have the narration tell us, oh, he's telling the truth, but he was also involved. That would have been fun. But again, it wasn't necessary. And I got sort of like big like Igor vibes, like the Hunchback henchman sort of vibes from him. He was a fun character again, which one I wish was just in it more and had other things besides just like the routine of providing us information. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about The Hollow Man slash The Three Coffins. Personally, one of my favorite John Dickson Carr novels. And again, usually like pretty universally recognized as one of his best novels as well. Next week, I'm going to change up from what I said on the schedule. Next week at the regular time, I will have the 75th anniversary retrospective for A Murder is Announced, and that will be posted Monday at noon at the regular time. On Wednesday, which is October 29th, that is the day the murder is announced, I will have a bonus video about how to solve a murder is announced using the meta clues I provided in my video on how to solve a murder mystery. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.